Let's start. GDPR, privacy, what does this mean for all of us? How can we build this out as a competitive advantage? Please welcome Tim Walters from Content Advisory. He is the principal strategist and privacy lead and one of the co-founders of Digital Clarity Group as well. Tim Walters, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Sonia. It's great to be back again at Connect. Just a quick word about the Content Advisory. First of all, just note that it's .net, not .com. All of my articles on the GDPR since the beginning of this year can be found there, and I also have some reports that are on the Digital Clarity Group website, including this one. So the necessary legal disclaimer, I am not a lawyer, and unlike Gregory Peck, I do not play one in the movies either. I am not offering legal advice or guidance. I'm just trying to help you understand what the impact will be of the GDPR on your organizations and specifically on your marketing activities. So I need to tell you a story, and this is a story in 3 parts. 66 million years ago, an asteroid about the size of Mount Everest and traveling at 72,000 kilometers per hour slammed into the Earth off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, and it forever changed the course of life on the planet. Barely 10 years ago, another object half the size of a pack of cigarettes and traveling at the speed of a Steve Jobs keynote presentation began to emerge from stores in North America. And while Steve Ballmer and the CEOs of Nokia, RIM, and Sony Ericsson literally laughed at it, it began slowly, but we now know inexorably and inevitably to fundamentally change the course of life on the planet. 170 days from now, which is about 115 working days, a third object consisting of 99 articles and 170 recitals and 260 pages in the English version, and traveling at the speed of an EU bureaucratic resolution, which means that it took about 5 years for it to escape the city limits of Brussels, will begin to fundamentally change the course of life for any business that touches the personal data of European residents. 66 million years ago, after the so-called Chicxulub impact, which I admit sounds like a merger between KFC and Jiffy Lube, the dinosaurs had no idea what was going to hit them, and they couldn't have done anything about it if they did. In a misguided attempt to localize my presentation, I made the dinosaurs into Stopfwafel and Kloppen. 10 years ago, this dinosaur could have known what was happening to him. He could have recognized that the iPhone represented a seismic revolutionary shift to mobile ubiquitous computing. But he was blinded by his own success. He was blinded by the paradigms that had made Microsoft successful as a desktop company, and he couldn't see what changes were upon him. And that's understandable because it's hard to make these bets on the future. Every day, executives and even every one of us are asked to weigh some impact of something that might happen, right? So that we have our friends from Gartner with our hype cycle trying to warn us that this might be more hype than reality. So the question for you guys is, each one of you is a potential dinosaur. And are you going to expire like the dinosaurs at the Chicxulub impact, or are you going to survive? And survival might be okay, it's better than expiring or being extinct, but what you really want to understand is how you're going to thrive in the new environment that's created by the GDPR. And you have an advantage over Steve Ballmer and every other executive who has to make some kind of gamble on what's going to happen in the future. Because with the GDPR, you know exactly what is going to happen. The text of the GDPR, and it's not impossible to read. It's certainly not written in legalese. It's no fun to read, but it's not impossible. The text of the GDPR is like a gift from the future. It's like the sports almanac in Back to the Future that makes Marty and/or Biff, I'm always confused about this, wealthy in another timeline. Because it tells you what is going to happen. It describes what the business environment is going to look like after May 25th, 2018. And therefore, it helps you understand to a great degree, not perfectly, how you need to adapt to that environment. So the GDPR has been called all of these things a revolution, not an evolution, basically a bomb placed into the plumbing of the most advanced monetization architecture, internet advertising, and a triumph of populist rhetoric over common sense. This is surprising because I thought that was a description of the last presidential election in the United States. So, a few basics about, who's never heard anything about the GDPR? Good, finally. Finally, normally majority say they haven't. It's extraterritorial. It applies not to companies within the EU. It doesn't protect or regulate companies in the EU. It protects the personal data of EU residents, not citizens, residents. If you are in the EU, you are protected by it. An Italian goes to Chicago, he's not protected. If the guy from Chicago comes to Paris for a vacation, he is protected. It will not be affected, or it will not shield the UK after Brexit. The UK is currently instituting what's called the Data Protection Bill, which is basically just taking the GDPR and turning it into UK law, and it will continue to rule after Brexit, whenever that happens. It concerns a great deal of data. So personal data is defined as data from which a living individual is identified or identifiable, directly or indirectly. That indirectly is very, very important. This is an update on legislation that was drafted in 1995, before the internet, basically before the commercial World Wide Web, before Facebook and social networks and the digitization of everyday life. So very importantly, it now includes digital fingerprints like device IDs, RFD tags, geolocation data, and so forth. All of that is personal data. A lot of the times when you're reading about the GDPR, it will say in one way or another, going forward, we must get explicit consent in order to use personal data. This is wrong. First of all, in most cases, if you use consent, you don't need explicit consent, you need what is called unambiguous consent. I can't take the time now to explain the difference between unambiguous and explicit, but there is one. Secondly, as you can see here, consent, asking someone for their permission and them deciding yes or no, is one of 6 legal grounds that you can use to process personal data under the GDPR. For marketers, the important ones are consent and legitimate interest. Legitimate interest is sometimes represented as some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for marketers. Like, because of the legitimate interest provision, we're not going to have to worry about the GDPR. This is also absolutely false. And again, I can't take time to explain it now because the legitimate interest is a very, very complex topic, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it afterwards. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about consent or about permissioning, because the important thing is that if you use the legitimate interest provision or the legal ground, you still need to get permission from the individual to use their personal data. In this case, it's not active permission in the sense of, may I use it, yes or no? It is rather a very clearly presented opt-out option. Very, very clearly presented. And so they still have to be informed by that option and decide not to act on it. It's still a form of permission. Okay, right at the beginning of the GDPR, there is this line: natural persons should have control of their own personal data. That's 10 words that we can easily reduce to 8 because natural persons are people and their own personal data is redundant. So people should have control of their personal data. What would follow from that principle? If you adopt that principle, if you agree with it, and you have to, what would follow from that? What kinds of activities would you engage in and not engage in? Well, it seems to me kind of logical that things like this, you would acknowledge that personal data belongs to the person it identifies and you're only borrowing it. You would ask permission before you borrowed it or took it. You would say what you were going to do with it. You would do only what you said you were going to do with it. You would keep it safe and secure from harm while you had it, and you would give it back, that is, in our terms, delete it, as soon as you were done with it. And you would not use it for some other purpose. You would not share it with someone else without permission. You would not certainly sell it as your own property. And guess what? That's exactly what the core principles of the GDPR say. So this is Article 5, and it lays out these 6 principles. Things like purpose limitation. You need to state a specific purpose for why you're collecting the data. You need to minimize the amount of data you use. You need to make sure that it's accurate. You need to store it for a limited amount of time and delete it as soon as you possibly can, and so forth. And these are joined by the so-called subject access rights. So consumers now have the right to write to you and demand, not ask, demand, do you have any of my data? What is it? I want an inventory of it. I want a copy of it. I want you to delete all of it, the right to be forgotten. Or portability. I want you to package up all of my data and send it to a competitor. Okay? And we'll get to that in a moment. All of this applies not only to the data that's within your firewall, as it were, but to any data that you use. So if you, as most organizations do, supplement your first-party data with second-party data from, say, your dealer network, if you're, say, an automobile manufacturer, or third-party data that you buy from a data broker or a data aggregator, you are responsible for the quality and the legitimacy of all of that data. You may not use third-party data that you acquire unless you are confident that it is compliant with the GDPR. Some people suggest that this will more or less kill the third-party data market, because where are data brokers going to get their data? Now they can just literally vacuum it up, more or less at will, at least in the United States. But under the GDPR, they're going to have to ask more or less explicitly, may I have your data in order to put it into a gigantic pool of other people's data and sell it to whomever I want, right? Who is possibly going to agree to that proposition? So I think that what we can say is that there will be a greatly reduced amount of third-party data, and what's left over will either be toxic, that is, you're not confident that it has been collected in the right way, or it will be highly, highly curated because it has been so carefully collected, and then it'll be very, very expensive. Also, data controllers, there's a difference between data controllers and data processors. Data controllers is the organization that determines the means of the processing and the purpose of the processing. And the data processors are companies that carry out the processing. They carry out the processing only on the explicit instructions of the controllers. As soon as a processor does anything else with the data, besides what the controller has told them to do, they become a controller themselves. So a controller has, any reasonable sized company has dozens of data processing partners. And each one of these might have dozens of sub-processors. The important thing here is that the GDPR establishes for the first time mutual liability among all of the players in this chain, which could be hundreds of firms. So think about what that means in terms of the contracts that you write with your data processors, all right, or vice versa. It makes everybody necessarily much more suspicious, if not paranoid, about who they're getting into business bed with if it involves personal data. So, PageFair created this graphic to illustrate how personal data is shared or leaked throughout the programmatic advertising ecosystem in the 200 milliseconds that it takes to ask for and do a bidding on and serve a programmatic ad. And this could be substituted by any data architecture of any reasonably complex customer experience management strategy. The only way to preserve this kind of operation, this kind of status quo, if it uses personal data, and I know that Bloomreach is very invested in showing ways to use non-personal data in order to do personalization. But if it involves personal data, as defined by the GDPR, the only way that this can happen is if many, if not most, of the consumers agree to provide consent for this kind of thing to continue to happen. And the question is that very likely? Are we going to provide consent? So there's a lot of evidence that we will not. So the continuing explosion in the adoption of ad blockers, which are very often used as tracking blockers, currently over 650 million worldwide. 66%, 2/3 of the Irish adults who were surveyed a few months ago said that they can't wait to exercise their right to be forgotten when the GDPR comes into effect. And 9 out of 10 consumers on a global survey said that they want more control over how their data is used. And also, again, PageFair said, well, let's just go to the streets and find out. So they created this kind of mock-up of a consent request. Okay? Very, very simple consent request, asking for one company. So they say brand name and their analytic partner. So let's just substitute a company there, like Philips. Okay? Philips and its analytic partners would like to collect your browsing habits on this site in order to better, to improve your experience. And don't worry, we'll delete all your data in 6 months. Yes or no? How many people would say okay to this? Okay. Who would say no? I think we're going to be about the same as the PageFair survey. 80% said no. Okay. 20% said yes. And when they created a mock-up of a tracking cookie approval. Again, 75% said they would reject all tracking or accept it only if it was strictly necessary in order to get the service that they were trying to access. Only 5% said they would accept all tracking, which is the status quo. Most of us, by default, accept all tracking because we're not using an ad or tracking blocker. So only 5% on this survey said that they would support, going forward, the current status quo that is the foundation of the entire advertising and MarTech ecosystem. I think it's necessary for all of us as an industry, I mean marketing practitioners, professionals like yourselves, vendors, service providers, analysts, to stop repeating the claim that customers happily trade their data for improved offers and convenience. First of all, the surveys indicate that it's not true. And secondly, it's moot. It's a moot argument. It's a moot point because the GDPR effectively outlaws most of the behavior that this kind of fallacy was meant to excuse. Because we've been telling ourselves this alleged fairy tale so that we could go out and vacuum up data whenever we wanted it, because consumers don't mind because we're improving their experiences. Well, you cannot vacuum up data any longer unless you have explicit, in this case, explicit consent. So look at this very kind of odd piece of advice from the Office of the Data Protection Authority in the UK, called the Information Commissioner's Office. Those organizations which thrive, not just survive, thrive under GDPR will be those who recognize that the key feature of GDPR is to put the individual at the heart of data protection law. So I think that what this means is that the GDPR basically makes customer centricity a legal requirement. You must maintain the consumer in the control of their personal data. For the first time, we've been talking about practicing customer centricity. Now you have to, in that sense. This is your post-GDPR world as a marketer, terra incognita. We move from an era of data superabundance, where it's digital exhaust that you can collect anytime you want, to an era of personal data scarcity, where you're borrowing the keys of the car that produced that exhaust. We move from an era where you were rewarded for being a data predator. As Tim O'Reilly said, he with the most data wins, to an era when you need to be and prove that you are a data shepherd. The ICO in the UK says they want data managed sensitively and ethically. And we move from an era of big data to what I call, too cutely, big data, where every time you want access to someone's personal data, you need to go and ask them and make a value proposition that's going to convince them to give it to you. I want to emphasize how utterly strange this world is. It's absolutely imperative that you do not look at the GDPR as just another layer of some kind of regulatory straitjacket that you have to live with while you continue trying to do business as usual. It is rather the description of an entirely new sport that you have never played before. It's like giving soccer players a broom and telling them they're going to start flying around in the sky. Okay? Now, obviously, when you get this playbook, the text of the GDPR, you want to understand the rules. You want to understand the borders, what you can do, what moves are allowed, what kinds of changes you can make to your uniform, so on and so forth, so that you can avoid the penalties. And if you do all of those things, you might avoid the penalties. You might avoid the 4% fines. but you'll still lose. If you want to win in this new environment, if you want to win at this new sport, you need to be creating and devising and practicing and improving and optimizing and burning into your muscle memory the new moves, plays, strategies that are going to allow you to dominate in this new playing field. So what are some of those moves that you want to master? We saw that consent requests are going to play a very big role. And the question is, how do you design these in a way that they're going to optimize the positive responses? Instead of just asking this like generic consent request form, you're probably going to want to design them as the best possible customer experience, thinking about who you're asking and so on and so forth. So clearly, these things should not be out-of-the-box templates. I think that these should be designed, tested, and optimized by marketing and customer experience professionals. Big question, is there a grandfather clause? What about all the personal data we already have? Can we keep using it? No, you can't. You can only use it if you can demonstrate that it was collected under conditions that satisfy the GDPR. And why would you have collected it under those conditions until you were forced to by the GDPR? So most likely, most of your existing personal data is not usable. So you then have to decide how much of it do you want to keep, how much of it would you like to still be able to use, and go and ask those people for re-consent or re-permissioning. Again, you're not just going to write them a letter, may I continue to use your data? No, you're going to try to convince them that it's a good idea that you get to use their data. Again, this is a task for marketing professionals. So what I'm saying is you need to start thinking about marketing for permissions. And you can use a great deal of your current tool set and your skill set, like building personas and personalization skills and targeting and so forth to help you do this. But now you're doing all of that not in order to better fill the top of the funnel or to better increase your conversion rate. You're doing it so that you have access to personal data, because personal data becomes that scarce commodity that you want to control. And remember, portability. Under certain conditions, which are quite broad, right, consumers can direct a business to extract all their personal data and send it directly to a competitor. This opens a whole new vector of competition, innovation, and promotion. How are you going to pitch? What services, what stories are you going to pitch to your competitors' customers so that you entice them, not only their business, but their data, to come to your business instead? And at the same time, how do you protect your own customer and your own personal data collection from poaching by your competitors? It brings us back to recital 7, which before the previous line that I quoted says, given the importance of creating the trust that will allow the digital economy to develop across the EU internal market. Okay? In the GDPR era, I want to suggest customer experience and engagement all comes down to trust, which means it all begins with trust. Since without trust, it will be difficult to get consent, and therefore it'll be impossible to access data, and it will be therefore be impossible to sustain a competitive proposition. In a commercial relationship, trust is an attitude that consumers have. And trustworthiness is a property that companies and brands exhibit. Okay? You nurture trust by being trustworthy, and you sustain it by demonstrating trustworthiness consistently. So just think about in this very nice picture, if the surfer dude drops that boy one time and he falls into what is evidently 2 inches of water onto the sand, he's probably going to be reluctant to engage in a long, ongoing relationship with that guy. Okay? So you can lose it immediately. Trust is very, very fragile. So if you think about the long customer life cycle that we like to look at, where is trust located now? I think it's clear that it's at the end, basically, not when I buy it. When I buy it, I'm still a little suspicious whether I've made the right decision. It's only after I use it and then I'm satisfied with it, then I might begin to say, okay, I trust this vendor and I'm okay buying stuff from them again. The GDPR, the question with the GDPR is, how can we move trust upstream in that life cycle? So this way, in your case, how can we move trust upstream? closer to or even at the beginning of the engagement, so that you can instill a sense of trust that's going to encourage consumers to allow you to have access to their personal data well before they actually make a purchase and become loyal advocates of your products and your brand. And I'm not going to try to answer this question today because I have 8 seconds left, but I can tell you that it is, in my view, the primary challenge for marketing and customer experience under the GDPR, and it's the one that you need to begin solving now internally with your broad ecosystem of providers and with your technology and agency partners. And that's it, thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that. I think that was the first GDPR primer that has left me feeling more informed than nervous and even a little bit excited, which a big thank you from the marketing is here. So we really appreciate it, everyone, Tim. And so